saying something.
Put them in too.
Yeah. Glad you're here. It's a great privilege to do this. Long before I met Dr. Maureen McCue in a book club, of course, she was a free-range kid exploring an old, poor North Side Milwaukee community that she was a part of until that intriguing inner city neighborhood was demolished. Can you hear me? No. Okay. No? This way? Yeah. Okay. Long before I met Dr. Maureen McCue in a book club, of course, she was a free-range kid exploring an old, poor North Side Milwaukee community that she was part of, until that intriguing, quote, inner city neighborhood was demolished and renovated in the name of urban renewal, supposedly for economic development. Skip all the way forward to college when socially aware Maureen, or Mickey as I've always known her, seized a unique year abroad opportunity to study and travel throughout India. That was followed by med school with an almost entirely male cohort of students. And years later, when she was traveling back and forth to work and learn as a physician in beautiful but conflict-driven Central America, she developed and completed an interdisciplinary PhD as an older, non-traditional student in epidemiology and medical anthropology. A combination of luck, being in the right place at the right time, and a drive to break through restraints of expectations and fear have propelled her to many parts of the world. For me, her complex stories of work and learning in Haiti come to my mind, but all of her endeavors, personal and professional, focus on the human right to health on a life-supporting, sustainable planet, with concerns about the health impacts of militarism, climate change, food policy, rights of women and the disabled. And yet, with this vast global perspective, she remains tethered, as she calls it, puts it, to the captivating life forces at work across her Iowa homestead and all along the amazing road that gets her there, back and forth, physically and metaphorically. So her subtitle is Sharing Life Along the Road. And it's a real road, but it's metaphor too. Now, let's tune our ears to the birds and frogs. Dr. Maureen McCue.
Okay, I can take my mask off too. Thank you so much, Mary Lynn. That was great. And thank you all for coming. What a beautiful night to be indoors. No, I appreciate that you all did come because it is, as I know, one of those last nights of this beautiful summer. So I've had a few gatherings to talk about my book. There's nothing like putting a book out right in the middle of COVID to learn how to be creative in developing an audience for your book. So I doubly appreciate that you are my biggest audience yet. And one of the things I've learned in having a few of these conversations, both with, I'm not talking into this, I'm talking into this. I don't have to hold it. What have I learned? I'm learning how to work microphones. I've learned that no matter who the audience is, whether it's an interview on the radio or the newspaper or it's a gathering, everybody's going to ask you unexpected questions and it's going to be an interesting conversation. So I look forward to your questions, but even though Mary Lynn did a great job of setting the stage, I did bring a few notes to read from my book. Thank you. So without further ado, I wanted to just go back a little tiny bit to the road itself. The whole book is, as Mary Lynn says, kind of a metaphor about the road we're all traveling, not just us here in the Iowa City community, but around the world. And one of the things that made me begin to think about actually writing this book was how many times when I was down an unknown road in Haiti or Ecuador or Bangladesh, and I said, oh, something about this road reminds me of home. And what I realized is that roads have lots of meanings and lots of shapes and lots of history. And so for anybody who's been raised in rural Iowa, you might know what a grade B unimproved road is. But if you haven't, if you grew up in the city, I live, as is implied by the title, on a very weather-dependent road. Some consider it the worst road in the county. I've heard that. Never mind that during pleasant weather, the road masquerades as a park. It's a colorful woodland, abundantly populated with diverse wildlife. Depending on the season and a traveler's mode of transportation, speed, direction, the road's persona can appear in many guises. In its physical dimensions, the road is too narrow in sections to allow simultaneous passage of any two vehicles going in opposite directions. It also sports a couple of deep inclines and a couple of 90-degree turns that completely block vision of any oncoming vehicles, travelers, animals, or any other flotsam or jetsam that may have landed in the road beyond the turn. And these elements of the road make up many of the stories. And as you know, we have some pretty dramatic weather here in Iowa, including winter weather, which can be pretty treacherous on this road. And weather conditions, as you may or may not realize, also interrupt travel on roads anywhere in the world. Some of the other things that I wrote about have to do with connectivity, and I don't mean via the internet. This is what everybody nowadays thinks is connectivity. But really, what is happening in the interdependent, interconnected human, animal, insect, and microbial populations. I mean, we've spent the last almost 2 years now talking about how microbes free range around the world. But if you pay attention long enough, you notice also how not only the humans as refugees, but animals are also circling and changing in their connections to all of us. And this changing nature that we're experiencing, these changing relations between all of the elements of nature, these changing stresses are producing winners and losers in a life around the planet that's very much out of balance. Throughout the book, I also write a lot about children because I think of children as the future, not to mention that they're very intriguing and entertaining little elements of our lives. And I spend some time talking about my son who is autistic and who himself has taught me how to look at the world in new and different ways, because his way of navigating life is very different than those of us who were fortunate enough to go on to higher education, college, and advanced degrees and professions. But I did want to just read a little short section of one of them about children. If I can find it, that is, okay. Michael, who didn't do anything that other quote-unquote neurotypical children did and made life fairly challenging when he was little, I discovered his relation to nature, his connection to nature was quite intriguing and unique. Michael discovered and made use of his own small, confined space, which I was told autistic children like, but when we made a small, confined space, forget that, that was boring, that was in his bedroom. But he found his own space under the fragrant and protective overhang of an aging lilac bush facing the pasture. At the time, it seemed he could sit there for hours. At this point, so many years later, I cannot now remember just how long he would sit there, but I well remember how I appreciated the peace and tranquility that descended on the house when he would wander out there. I could easily see him from the house, just sitting quietly, watching the horses in the pasture, stroking either the cat or the dog, or gesturing and talking to imaginary friends. He still does that a lot, but interestingly, as a fully formed large adult, he still will stand almost transfixed and watch the birds on the porch or watch little creatures outside. So he's very connected in a way that many of us just take wildlife for granted. To see him sitting there appearing so alert and calm, or later happily climbing up trees with low boughs, brought back memories of my own childhood, exploring the neighborhood, the parks, the open, undeveloped nearby spaces. When I was a child, beyond the time required for meals, school, and lunch, space and time were only loosely planned. I imagine that may have been similar for many of you. Left to my own devices most of the time, I could wander and imagine myself in all sorts of other times, places, and roles. When in such a calm, natural setting, Michael too enjoyed the freedom of movement and unplanned exploration, despite whatever other impediments or impairments he exhibited. In that sense, Michael's autism allowed him a kind of freedom many modern children no longer experience. And I put in here many of the different experiences we've had with children as we've seen the changes over the years. One of the other themes I explore are about ownership and privilege. It's another area where too often, I think, we tend to take our privilege as owners very much for granted, and unquestionably so. I have a chapter that's called A Plague of Raccoons, Deer, Groundhogs, Small Rodents, and Other Unwanted Visitors. Whose home is it anyway? Before living along my road, I never seriously examined or questioned my notions of entitlement or right of occupancy to my home and property, any more than I had questioned the meaning of roads and roadways. Like most who've grown up in this nation, I lived with a vague intellectual realization that our land was appropriated by Euro-Americans generations ago from those indigenous to the land. The faceless impersonality of that core claim of history never penetrated deeply enough to alter my day-to-day sense of ownership. For me, the facts of ownership were long established and supported by that pile of legal papers, including survey plots, deeds, bank mortgages, and many other miscellaneous and indecipherable documents. Anybody who's bought a home knows exactly what I'm talking about. They're about that thick. Nobody ever reads them, you just sign them. In a similar way, the disjunction between what I knew at some level to be my position of privilege in asserting ownership over a home on 14 acres, while simultaneously overlooking the near countless homeless others on the planet, was another short-circuited communication between my moral, social, and economic self. And for those of you who haven't done as much travel abroad, as happens, in fact, just go to LA or Chicago or New York. As happens in major cities in this country, but even more so when traveling or working in India, Bangladesh, Haiti, Nicaragua, and elsewhere, the unavoidable awareness of bodies sleeping in all manner of dark corners, in fact, uptown by the library, in unstable, rank, and overcrowded squatter settlements at city edges, along roadways and busy thoroughfares, creates a self-protective, delusional state of disconnection. As modernity increasingly concentrates wealth and equates value and ownership, homelessness becomes ever more pervasive and seemingly irresolvable. It is one of the things that I found most troubling about traveling, and it's still one of the things I find most troubling when even coming into Iowa City. As you know, we have more and more homeless here. And then weather, as Mary Lynn alluded, I've spent a lot of time talking about the changing climate. In fact, I came here, I don't know if any of you were here for that talk a few years ago, talking about climate change. But it's hard to miss what's going on around us, and it's hard to miss what that means for all of our lives and our connections, our families, our future. So when I went to India as a young woman, as a very young, naive, inexperienced, agog kind of person at 21, I ran into my first notion of weather that's very different elsewhere. Living abroad in India for a year during college was my first introduction to the very real differences that various climate patterns bring to life's rhythm and culture. As a third-year college student, I arrived in India just ahead of the opening days of the annual monsoon season. Somebody had told me that was what was going to happen, but until you experience the first day of a monsoon, you haven't lived. This powerful Asian weather is anticipated and greeted with joy across the region. The sudden start of heavy rain brings an end to months of mildly chilly, gray, dusty, dirty weather. Just as I took snow and cold for granted as a child, the Indians around me, drenched by the rain, expressed anything but misery. Like me as a child experiencing winter's first snowfall, they were exhilarated by and celebrated the intoxicating, really steamy downpour. Observing this reaction helped me begin to understand that what may be perceived as extreme by outsiders may be experienced as a long-awaited and intensely enjoyable natural wonder for locals. Predictable weather patterns provide the familiar backdrop of life. As the monsoon rains continued, I lived through my first experience of flooding. With the unremitting rain, the local roads soon became rivers, and as you know, here in Iowa, our first roads were indeed rivers, and the notion of rivers and roads are intertwined also in the development of culture and community. Initially, I merely felt frustrated that I could no longer reliably manage to get around town on my bike. Eventually, I became frightened when I noticed that not just affected men, women, and children were on the move, but small animals, including the snakes, started to move to higher, drier ground. And so I followed the theme of weather also along the road, because as I became a professional, I began to experience flooding in southern Illinois also, which moved everybody and moved people into housing and living situations that were quite difficult. And it was my first experience in realizing how weather affected health and well-being, particularly of women and children. And then my most fun chapter is about my life without electricity. Now, many of you may have also lived without electricity for various times. I mean, most of the time we think of it as just a pain in the butt when the electric company goes down or when weather causes electricity to go down. But I actually enjoyed it for a summer. Why, you might say? Because I'm stubborn. The backstory is that the rural electric company where I lived and worked in southern Illinois insisted that you go out and read your meter every month. It was in my backyard. I had to go out and read it. But damn, if every time it was time to read my meter, there was an emergency in the emergency room, or there was a woman going into labor, and if you've been with women who are in labor. Sometimes you think it's going to be over in an hour or two. The women in here know that. But it can be 2 days. And so I would be stuck in town, and I couldn't read the damn meter. And every time I was late, and every time I had to pay a fine. And so one day, they called me up and said, you know, you owe us extra dollars because you didn't read your meter. And if you keep this up, we're going to have to cut off your service. And I said, well, fine, do it. And they did. And so I lived without electricity for a summer. But it wasn't so hard. Living abroad in India for a year during college was my first introduction to the very real differences that various climatic patterns bring to life's culture and rhythms. Oh wait, I read that already. I am so sorry. It's in 184. For those of you who have the book, you could read along, but I'm not a professional yet. I'm working on it. Okay. Living without electricity was not the hardest thing I ever had to do. Far from it. Despite a few obvious drawbacks, it took very little time to relearn the pleasures of living, eating, reading, and writing before dark, or by kerosene or candlelight. I'd already had quite a bit of practice living without electricity when I lived in India. Service there was, and in some areas still is, limited to a few hours each day, if there's any available at all. In fact, for the most part, life without electricity in southern Illinois was generally quite manageable and even pleasurable, just as it had been in India. My sense of connection to the wider world did not change. I did not have a television in either India or southern Illinois, so I didn't miss that. I regularly purchased newsletters or newspapers with my groceries. I heard the latest news on the car radio while making work rounds. For entertainment, just as I had spent relaxed evenings with friends in India who shared stories, danced, played guitar, or sang together, my daughter and I too devised ways to entertain each other, visiting with our neighbors or simply singing together. We did whatever had been done around the world across time before the installation of electricity. Living without it imposed the necessity of recognizing living within and appreciating nature's free daylight and related services. Living that way is something like enjoying the simple pleasures of an extended camping trip, yet with a comfortable bed at the end of the day. With no electricity, there's also no pump in the well, however, to bring water into the house. And as when camping, animal activity, smells, the sounds of the wind in the tree, the glitter of the stars, all became much more apparent. For the duration of my self-imposed outage, I got up earlier in the morning. I planned meals carefully. Luckily, I did have a gas stove, so as not to generate much garbage or require much cleanup or refrigeration. Good habits to cultivate, I believe, for any circumstance. I had an ice box when I was a kid. Did you guys have ice boxes? So you know you can live with ice and not necessarily electricity. Melted ice, a couple 5-gallon buckets of water from work daily sufficed for washing, bathing, and toilet flushing. Life in an impoverished country like India, Nicaragua, Bangladesh, or Haiti, where I have visited and worked off and on in the intervening years, does not include reliable electricity, hot or predictably piped water. Living with an unpredictable or regular shortage of water teaches a person how to shower quickly and completely in 5 or fewer gallons of water. And daily showering, as is done in this country, is a highly overrated hygiene practice, in my humble opinion. So I've run out of my reading time, but I just wanted to mention I do spend some time looking at water rights, whether it's theirs or ours, and define the theirs. Bridges, which are really part of the social infrastructure of roads, because we lost our bridge for a while until there was a death foretold. That's all in there. And being consumed by consumption, this is what happened to my son when he grew up. Very much wanted to consume every item he saw advertised on television. I think television is very bad for children, but that's my opinion. And just how are we going to respond to today's challenges? How will we get off this road that we're on and moving forward? Which brings us to the open part of the evening. If you have questions, if you have comments, I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you coming, but I'd love to hear what some of your questions or comments might be. Yes? What part of Iowa do I live in?
Yeah.
Here in Johnson County, on the worst road in the county.
Yeah.
For 35 years, I forgot to mention that. So I've been there long enough to notice changes over time.
Well, I've had the opportunity to be in Johnson County off and on now for since the 1940s.
Oh, you beat me.
And raised 6 children here. I remember 4 children here. I had 5 siblings, and they're now lawyers and doctors and so forth. Sure. But they have much just from San Diego, and the other half of the city, eastern side. I went to college in Baltimore, and then I came to medical school here, and it was a very interesting time because people in those 2 areas were undergoing different parts of what I think you described, and it was quite one thing to bed at night in Baltimore in my apartment and get a call from a nurse or a physician and ask demand that I go in right away. But even in Baltimore, the weather is not always as good as it might seem on other days.
You know, it's hard to repeat the question, but did you hear enough about?
Well, he was just commenting about life raising a family and having a profession here in Johnson County, so I'm thinking he's saying he can relate to some of the stories, but also reflecting on weather between California here and Baltimore, Maryland, and yeah, they're all quite different. I have family in San Diego, so I look forward to seeing them sometime when it's really ugly here. It's really nice there.
Could you just list some of your chapters? Could you just?
Oh, sure. There's just 10. One is Life at the Unseen Edges, why I decided to come here, basically, leaving Southern Illinois, where I had thought I was on the world's best road. I had the most interesting job, but a lot of problems hid under the surface. And so I came to my road, which at the time I found it was the road at the end of the world. I was looking for someplace. Night was coming. I was driving further and further backwoods, and I came to a point where I got nervous that I couldn't turn around and get out. But then I saw the little for sale sign in this overgrown area of brush, and I actually walked up the driveway and asked, is that real? And they were like shocked that somebody came to the end of the world to ask about the house, and that was the house I moved into. And then I have one called Secrets of a Road Across Time and Space, where I actually try to explore the whole concept of roads as I've encountered them around the world, and what is it about a road in Ecuador or a road in India that makes me think of home, and what are the elements to these roads. And at the same time, how creative people are about the use of their roads elsewhere. Roads just serve so many functions. Here, they have to be safe, they have to be fast. But in many parts of the world, that's where you buy your tea on the side of the road. That's where you pick up your chicken for the night. That's where all the dogs in the neighborhood come together. That's where the pastries are sold. I mean, they just have these blankets set up everywhere along the road. Katie, you've seen that, haven't you? Yeah. Selling all sorts of things that you can't imagine. And in Haiti, which, good grief, what's going on there now, but it's been so poor for so long, they even have roadside stands of mud cookies. They put a little flavoring, a little sugar in with the mud, and as the doctor knows, women who are malnourished have a habit of eating dirt because it contains a little bit of the minerals that their diets are missing. It's called pica. And so these cookies actually sell in Haiti, and they're set up on the side of the road. Anyway, you can do almost any kind of commerce along a road in many parts of the world that you can't do here. Other differences, of course, along roads are roads that are built into mountainsides, roads that are extremely dangerous and frightening. If you live out in Colorado, you get a little sense of that, or a little bit of that in Switzerland, but it's really frightening in Ecuador and elsewhere. The other chapter is about autism meeting open space, where I read about Michael. The other is Whose Home Is It Anyway, with a picture of the raccoons that tried to destroy my house and get rid of us. We have since learned how to capture them and take them to the bioreserve. My friends asked me if we've tagged any of them to find out if they're just coming back home, but I don't think they are, because they're across a highway and across a river, and I think they'd have to be really ambitious to come back. And then I spend a lot of time talking about invasions in another chapter with altered ecosystems. We're talking about refugees as invasions of them. And if any of you are gardeners, we of course have all kinds of invasions of plants and invasions of other animals. And that's part of the world as it had been, kind of coming unglued. And then I have a chapter on changes, disappearances, and chance encounters, where I talk about my bats and about lightning bugs and things that we see in different proportions now than we were when we were kids. When we were kids, we saw lightning bugs everywhere. Now we're lucky to see them in our yards. And then a grown-up autistic picture about being consumed by consumption, going to seed, some things gained, many things lost, and final chapter on kind of we're at the crossroads, how do we travel to an uncertain future? And I had a surprise story right toward the end that I hope people will get to. I won't tell you, but it was the most amazing surprise I think I've ever encountered, particularly in a Buddhist monastery on the edge of a very busy, contaminated city in Bangladesh. So I encourage you to read to the end, just to find who I put in there. Dorothy's right next to you.
Well, you said that you were lucky to have a gas stove.
Yeah.
Mother Jones just published an article on how gas stoves are toxic and they should never be used in a house. So why did you have a gas stove?
Because that was 40 years ago, and we didn't know these things, and if you're going to live without electricity, it allowed me to live. No, I would not buy a gas stove today. I would not recommend a gas stove to anyone, and I suppose if you were going to live without electricity, you'd have to have a little sterno or your barbecue or something like that, but it was what I had at the time. And there's a lot of evidence coming out about all the health implications of relying on gas stoves. So you are absolutely right, Dorothy, but 40 years ago, who knew? Or who knew enough to...
Well, they convinced American women all to buy gas stoves.
Yes, yeah. When I go into the appliance store, because The other thing about getting older is that all your appliances get older, and all of our appliances have been dying lately. And we did have to get a new stove. And I started to lecture the salespeople. You know, all these gas stoves you got lined up here, they're just going to go out of style very soon because there are going to be increasing rules about the use of natural gas in people's kitchens. And of course, they don't want to hear it, but yeah, that's what's going to happen.
Well, another question I have is, and it's not related, well, it is related to what you were talking about.
You guys can't hear her back there. Yeah.
Just repeat it after.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, the plan to build a tunnel in Iowa.
You're talking about CO2 capture.
Right.
Yeah,
For the purpose of our continued use of ethanol,
yes.
and we're supposed to be moving towards the use of electric cars.
Yes. Dorothy's going way beyond my book. In fact, that's a book after my next book, probably. Yeah, for anybody who hasn't been following about pipeline stories and carbon capture, totally off the subject. But it is a very scary thing that's going on in this state and in fact across the country, where billions of dollars are being plunked into a real boondoggle for the petroleum industry, the ethanol industry, to keep producing, keep doing what they're doing, and taking a lot of public money to do it, to create these pipelines to transport liquefied CO2. Whole nother story. We could have another meeting on that. Anybody else? Katie, you're never so shy. Such a shy group. Or I'm so boring, I don't know which it is.
What kind of doctor are you?
What kind of doctor am I? Retired! No, I did a family practice for 25 years, and then I did another 10 years of women's health only. And then I spent somewhere with overlaps happening there because I'm not 120 yet, working as a professor in global health and doing a lot of traveling. So my PhD, which is a story that I don't have in here, and in some ways I think I should, my PhD was given to me actually by Nicaraguans. I had the temerity to go down to Nicaragua to talk to a bunch of Nicaraguan physicians about how to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. I mean, here I am, a woman speaking broken Spanish, talking about sexually transmitted diseases, and I mentioned the risks of cervical cancer. Bingo, that was my PhD. Why do we have so much cervical cancer down here? Which they do. So I did a project, a PhD project, in several women's clinics looking at the factors that were contributing to their high rate of cervical cancer. So that was a very interesting study, looking at the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, looking at early onset of sexual activity, looking at how doctors defined inflammation, how women define inflammation, women who carry these huge loads on their head every day, constantly have backaches and neck aches and abdominal aches. I mean, I can't even imagine how they do it. And so they called it inflammato. Doctors call inflammation something that shows white cells. On pap smears, they talk about inflammation as in the white cells around your cervix, many of which are sort of normal. And so there was a whole confusion and conflation of this notion of inflammation. It was a very interesting cross-cultural study about a term that's used by women to mean one thing, used by the drug company to mean another thing, and used by doctors and cytologists to mean yet another thing, and trying to ferret that all out with real women, real families, really different sexual mores, et cetera, made for an interesting...
Where did you get your MD?
My MD comes from Wisconsin. Because I grew up in Milwaukee, and then went to Madison for college. And my favorite story from being one of a few women in medical school, and I don't know, you're just enough older than me, but I will never, ever forget being one pregnant in medical school. I was the first one to do that. Very bad, very bad. But the professors really did show the bunnies, the Playboy bunnies, and walk in with a cigar showing Playboy bunnies. And I'm a medical student who's pregnant. Oh, it was very sickening on all levels, emotionally and physically, but we made it through. Yeah, Peter.
Looking back in your adult life, if you had to do over again, is there anything you do differently?
Nah. I might be less nice to one or two friends who would call me in the middle of the night and say, "Mickey, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I didn't want to bother my real doctor." And I was on call all the time. and I would say, "Oh, that's okay." That I would change, but other than that, no, I've had a great ride. I've been extremely privileged. I've had wonderful students, wonderful colleagues. I can't think, well, I have had one that I didn't like, but yeah. Into life, everyone's life, one colleague that you really don't like happens, but no. It's been a good life. And I intend for it to last a little while longer, yeah. God willing. Yeah. This is my publisher coming up with unfair questions.
The first one is, there are two questions. The first is, what about the frogs at night? And then, why do you think the road that we're following for climate change is so incredibly hard to get off of? And not like 3-hour answer, but just like, it seems
The frogs and the birds come from my travels, because clearly we forget these little wonderful creatures. The birds especially. You can hear the birds from my backyard when you go to the cloud forest in Ecuador. And sometimes even in Managua, Nicaragua. There was a bird I used to hear all the time in the morning there, and I hear it in the morning here, and every time it brings that back to me. And the frogs, obviously, every year when we're talking about climate change, I listen so hard for the first frogs. Am I still going to have frogs? I have far fewer frogs and toads than I used to have. And every time I see one, it's just a little precious creature, because, as you know, frogs and birds are very sensitive to our changing environment. And so my awareness of them is really at high alert all the time. My bats as well, but I couldn't put all that many animals in the title. And clearly it's the birds you hear in the morning and the frogs at night that remind me that life is still somewhat intact. Why we can't get off this road, God, it's something I ask myself at least 5 times a day minimum. One of the things I think is because we have certain attitudes besides freedom to not wear a mask, an attitude that says we can go fast, we must go fast. And that requires a lot of energy, but it's also related to our sense of power and individualism. And I think until we really begin to look inside at what our core values are, what our core personal drivers are, really asking what do we really need, we are not going to get off this path. Unless somebody really powerful and authoritarian and really benevolent changes it, but that ain't going to happen. Pardon? Yeah, if everybody else spent time in Nicaragua and India and Haiti, they'd know they could live without electricity. I know most of the people in this room probably have lived more without electricity than most of the younger people in our society. But until you have those experiences, you don't realize. Yeah.
And yet, if I follow up on that, your comments about the gas stove and what we know now that we did not know 40 years ago lead me to ask, is there anything that you see in our contemporary, technologically sophisticated world that does give you hope in terms of combating climate change and its effects? In other words, rather than saying it gives us power that makes us do the wrong thing, is there any way in which you can see something that helps us?
Well, I did say I always had wonderful students, and I do think it's the youth. Greta Thunberg has been a leader among many, and Garza and the Black Lives Movement, and what's her name in the Me Too movement, and many of the other, well, she's not so young, she's like 45 or something.
Seems young to us.
Yeah. But I really do think it's the younger people who actually don't have as much of a connection to quite all of the technological comforts, that people have come to expect. And I think, if we give them the space to do what they know needs to be done, there's some hope there. I really do feel that they are saying we don't all need cars, we can get by with scooters and bikes, and we don't all need to have large apartments. My grandson, bless his soul, he's 18. He just moved in with his girlfriend and his best friend, 3 of them, in an apartment, 850 square feet. None of us as singles anymore could imagine doing that, but to him, it's great fun. He's going to have a wonderful time. It's a good price, only $2,000 a month, San Diego. 850 square feet, 3 people, 2 bathrooms. They have a little eating nook, and he says they do have a refrigerator and a stove. But I mean, clearly, he's telling us we don't need all that space. We don't need all that furniture. We don't need all that closets, storage, what have you. So I do feel younger people, if there's any hope, it's the younger people. And their voice has got to come through, and we've got to help allow that voice to come through. Yep.
With electric cars, where's the graveyard for the batteries?
These are kinds of questions I've been asking myself. I know that our old lead-based batteries are really a problem. I know that the lithium that goes into the new batteries is a problem. I do know that they last a long time, relative speaking. I think it's an unsolved technological problem, and I think the real answer is in mass transit, in commuter trains and things like that that don't rely as much. I don't see electric vehicles as individual cars, 2 in every garage, as the solution to anything. I think they're an okay while we don't have mass transit, while we don't have trains, but I think we have to keep pushing for those as well.
I think the people that manufacture the automobiles trying to decide what to do.
I think in all cases of heavy technology, literally heavy, cars are heavy, and appliances and things, that we really need to develop not only a sense of our own values, but also the value of a circular economy, so that whatever we're purchasing, it comes with a little card that says, when you're done, turn it in for an upgraded version, and we'll use this to create the next upgraded version, so that things aren't constantly being torn out of the planet and rearranged and then thrown into a junkyard. We don't have enough space. We don't have enough water. We don't have enough anything to continue that kind of model. And so we really have to push for that serve the whole community, walkable communities, mass transit, as well as circular economy, where you buy something, you turn the old one in so that it gets redone, remade. And also with everything, the right to repair is an interesting concept. We used to all repair everything. You knew the guy in the next block who could repair anything. Those people have just disappeared. We can't repair things because it's all on somebody's computer and it's all owned by the car manufacturer. So there's a lot of questions. It's not just the battery, it's the whole friggin' concept that needs readdressing, I think. My humble opinion. Pardon? You got the microphone. What? I'm happy. I thought it was a great discussion. It's everybody's bedtime. Steve brought a whole bunch of books. Well, he brought a handful of books, sorry. And I'm happy to sign them and personalize them if you want. They're in the back. And I do appreciate you coming, being attentive, asking questions. Happy to continue the conversation one-on-one if you wish, over in the book signing or in the, what do you call it, behind here?
We nicknamed it the pub. It has an official name called Mixers on Fifth.
The Mixers on Fifth.
But I think it closes at 8.
Nobody told me that. And I didn't bring a bottle. Oh, well, good night if you're leaving. Thanks again.